Cheers, and welcome back for another episode of Puff Puff Pondercast, where lit minds lead lit lives. I'm your host, Emily, and I'm really glad that you stopped by. I know I am a few days late with this episode, but I've never been the most set on schedule, so just know that I am trying my best. Plus, if I'm not doing this for me, then what's it for? To be honest with you, I'm having such a blast figuring this out, but it is time consuming. And as a solo mom, I don't get the most time to just sit down and read and ramble. To be fair, it's probably one of the reasons why I haven't picked up reading in the past few years. This is literally the main reason for doing this, even if it is just me talking into the void. So if I do get these episodes out on time, gold star for me, and if not, just know that there's always one coming. Plus, you can always reach me through Instagram or over on X at PuffPuffPondercast, how you see on the screen, or click the link in the description box below. Now today, we get to finish out our assigned reading on Burning Rainbow Farm by Dean Kuipers. We've got chapters 16 through 19 and the epilogue to go through. And I just want to say that I thought I knew this story going into these chapters. I thought I had a decent grasp on the playout of what was going to happen just from the way that Kuipers set up the book. I've also had some friends in the community who have read this book and shared their insights on what happened. But to sit here and to read it for myself, to have the details that were provided and the recounts from those that were present, and just to have the outcome be what it really was. I mean, he doesn't gory it up, it's not dramatized in any way, but it's just an unfortunate and terrifying reality. Throughout the book, we've seen Tom's journey at Rainbow Farm through the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And it was marked by his passionate yet increasingly desperate attempt to create a space that embodied his belief in cannabis reform and liberal humanism. By 2000, things had become even more difficult due to the consistent legal pressure from Scott Teeter and the financial strains despite the farm's ambitious efforts with its festivals and fundraising. I mean, initially, Tom had grand plans, and he drew his inspiration from places like Mendocino County in California, where pot-friendly authorities had been elected. And he wanted Rainbow Farm to influence local politics in a similar way. He sought out candidates to run for sheriff and prosecutor in Cass County. But despite their efforts, no viable candidates ever emerged. And it led the current runners unchallenged. Rainbow Farm did not limit itself with local politics. That summer, it became a hub for political activity, and it attracted these fringe political groups like the Libertarians and the Greens, who fought strongly for ecological sustainability, social justice, grassroots democracy, and overall just peace and nonviolence. Figures like Jeffrey Feiger, who was a Democratic gubernatorial candidate, visited the farm, but his reluctance to publicly align himself with its controversial causes really disappointed Tom. And events like the Hemp Aid Festival really became platforms for activists and musicians, with speakers like Stephen Gaskin delivering messages that tied cannabis to broader, more spiritualistic values. Gaskin, he was a charismatic feature from the countercultural movement, and he deeply influenced Tom. His philosophies emphasized that cannabis was not merely recreational, but it could be sacramental, a means of fostering empathy, reducing aggression, and connecting spiritually with the earth. Now, Tom, as I'm sure that most of us who partake, resonate with those ideas as well. And Tom saw his land as a spiritual sanctuary. The authorities, who were very disconnected from the farm's ethos, responded harshly, and they used roadblocks and intimidation to deter attendance to these events, which really crippled the farm financially. So while these struggles were mounting, Tom had heavily invested in the infrastructure on the farm. He was still expanding facilities like the camp store and adding amenities to try to attract more visitors. But the events barely broke even. And despite hosting noticeable acts like Merle Haggard and launching these ambitious festivals like High Times World Expo Extravaganza, extravaganza, attendance fell short to the state police's persistent interference. Now, despite his aspirations for Rainbow Farm to symbolize this freedom, community, and reform, Tom's dream was overshadowed by external hostility and internal conflicts. After that winter in 2000 had passed, a tragic accident had sent shockwaves through the region. On April 21st of 2001, a 17-year-old high schooler named Conrad Joseph Hornrack ran a stop sign in rural Michigan and had collided with a school bus carrying a high school varsity softball team. Now, while the bus was tipped over and it did cause some minor injuries to some of the passengers, the only life that was lost was Conrad's. His car crushed him and killed him on the spot. This crash occurred in broad daylight, but what gave it some weight, or at least in the eyes of authority, was that Conrad was wearing a Rainbow Farm wristband. Now, this wristband suggested that Conrad may have attended the farm's 420 festival the night before. The event had been a rare financial victory for Rainbow Farm, and it drew in a crowd of over 1,000 attendees who paid about $25 each. It was enough to pull Tom and his team out of this financial hole and fund deposits for their upcoming Hemp Aid Festival. However, the connection to Hornack's accident raised some troubling questions. No one at Rainbow Farm remembered seeing Conrad, and there was no immediate evidence linking the festival to the crash. His best friend later admitted to the police that they had taken LSD and smoked weed at the farm before Conrad had left around 2 a.m. But it was truly unclear if any substances had played a role in the accident. The authorities, who were led by prosecutor Scott Teeter, seized this incident as an opportunity to escalate their focus on Rainbow Farm. Teeter decided that it was time to act, but instead of going straight for drug charges, he used a familiar tactic: tax evasion. He built his case on a claim from a confidential informant who had worked as a cashier on the farm. Now, according to the informant, the farm hadn't withheld payroll taxes. However, this was not the whole story. Rainbow Farm didn't have traditional employees. Workers were paid as contractors and issued 1099 forms. And Derek, who managed payroll, had even consulted with H&R Block to ensure the compliance. Now, despite Rainbow Farm's records being in order, Teeter and his team spun the situation into a pretext for a raid. Using the SWAT team, which is the Southwest Enforcement Team, investigators created a pile of speculative documents estimating the farm's revenue and cash flow. They portrayed Rainbow Farm as an operation with shadowy finances, even though no one bothered to check the farm's accounts. The situation was further complicated by a completely unrelated lawsuit. A security contractor named Mike Long was suing Tom for about $10,000, claiming that he had been promised a trip to the Cannabis Cup in Amsterdam as a bonus. And though he lost the case, the lawsuit did add fuel to the narrative that Rainbow Farm was dodgy in its dealings. On May 9th in 2001, Teeter's campaign came to a head with a raid on Rainbow Farm. Officially, the raid was about taxes, but it became clear almost immediately that drugs were the real focus. Derek, who was exhausted from a late-night patrol, was jolted awake by the sound of officers storming into his office. There were armed police in ski masks and tactical gear swarmed, and they shouted orders demanding to know where the drugs were. It was true chaos. Campers were dragged from their tents, some of them half-dressed, and Rainbow Farm regulars like Travis Hopkins and even visitors were detained and rounded up. Tom and Raleigh were arrested and hauled outside under the watchful eye of armed officers, and Tom's anger boiled over as he was led away, unleashing a tirade against the authorities that was captured on video. The raid revealed what Teeter and Sweat had been hoping for. They found a grow room in the farmhouse's basement. Inside, officers found over 300 cannabis plants in various stages of growth, along with high-tech cultivation equipment. And this was a huge blow to Rainbow Farm that they just could not recover from. Manufacturing marijuana at the time was a felony, and for Tom and Raleigh, it carried the possibility of significant prison time. The raid left just a trail of devastation, both physical and emotional. The farm was ransacked, and cops even seized merchandise from the store, like bongs and t-shirts, as evidence. For the people that were living there, the raid shattered any sense of security. Derek described how the experience left him psychologically shaken and afraid to sleep without clothes on in case the police returned. Other employees, like Nikki Lester, tried to clean up the mess, but really they just struggled with the farm's new reality. For Tom and Raleigh, the fallout was deeply personal. They were released on bail, but their sense of hope was just rapidly fading. Tom, who was once this optimistic problem solver, became consumed by rage and guilt, and he blamed himself for the decisions that had led to this point. Raleigh, who was desperately trying to regain custody of his son Robert, found himself stuck between his loyalty to Tom and the mounting legal pressures. The two men, who were now under strict bail conditions, tried to comply with the law while simultaneously preparing for what felt like this inevitable collapse. The raid was not just about seizing drugs, though. It was about dismantling Rainbow Farm piece by piece. And shortly after the raid, Child Protective Services completely removed Robert from Raleigh's care, citing concern over the presence of marijuana and firearms at the property. He wasn't even given a phone call to inform him that his son was removed from the school. He only found out that afternoon as he waited for his son at the bus stop, only for the bus to drive right past without stopping. Now, Tom and Raleigh, they scrambled to keep the farm running while dealing with these mounting legal battles. They held yard sales to raise money, and they sold off farm equipment, and they even hawked off their Rolls Royce to pay the bail and the legal fees. The strain on their finances mirrored the emotional toll, and both men were growing isolated and despondent. Tom's anger towards Teeter became all-consuming. He railed against the prosecutor's tactics, feeling that the law was being weaponized to strip him of everything that he had built. And at the same time, he began to drink heavily and retreat from his community, the one that had once rallied around him. His optimism and his determination gave way to a grim appearance on truly what lay ahead. After the raid, Tom and Raleigh tried to pick up the pieces, but the strain was unbearable. The property was left in disarray with open doors and scattered belongings, just leaving this terrible reminder of the chaos that had just happened. The store was ransacked and some personal items were taken as evidence. The farm's financial situation worsened as it became clear that Hemp Aid 2001, which was their next big event, was officially canceled. Worse yet, Teeter filed for the farm's forfeiture, and it was a move that loomed like a death sentence over all of their dreams. Raleigh was particularly shaken after his son Robert was taken by the Child Protective Services. The removal of Robert was shocking. He was always described as a bright and well-adjusted boy, and it just seemed less about protecting him, but more about exerting control over the men. Raleigh was devastated, and he lashed out in frustration, but he resolved to do everything possible to get his son back. He attended meetings, complied with court requirements, and even attempted to quit smoking cannabis, though his efforts were undermined by his surroundings. I don't know why he just wouldn't leave. That was his boy, his baby. But he would rather stay with Tom and lose custody, and it just doesn't make sense to me. And this is something that I am terrified of, and that I have been since I've even approached the cannabis field. I've always made sure to follow my state's laws and comply with the legalities, but it still doesn't feel safe. It's something that I use as medicine in therapeutic forms, from the hands-on gardening aspect to the effects benefiting me from consuming the plant's product. When I found cannabis, I found something that gave me spoons back, even on the bad days. But I know without a doubt that I would put it all behind me and suffer in the most peace I will have ever known, just to have my babies in my home by my side. No matter how much I love this plant, no matter how much of a benefit that I receive from it, I could not and I would not ever choose cannabis over my children. Now, Tom, he was losing the will to fight through these legal battles. After meeting with a high-profile attorney who demanded $150,000 up front, literally just to open the case, Tom realized that he did not have the resources for the kind of defense that he needed. The optimism that once fueled his activism was replaced with bitterness and despair. In private moments, Tom confessed to those around him that he felt trapped. He spoke ominously about being ready to die rather than letting the government take his farm, and his frustration with the system was visible. He saw the forfeiture as this final, intolerable injustice, and to him, Rainbow Farm was more than just land. It was his symbol of freedom, his safe space for people who shared his ideals. And losing it would mean losing everything. So as the summer dragged on, Rainbow Farm's once thriving community grew smaller. Many of the original attendees had moved on, leaving behind a mix of devoted regulars and some newcomers who didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. For Derek, the raid had been the breaking point, and he decided that it was time for him to step away. He packed up his belongings and left, and was just overwhelmed by the toll of living under a constant threat. Raleigh, on the other hand, clung to the hope of reuniting with Robert. He threw himself into renovations on the farm and worked with members to make it more suitable for a home inspection. But Raleigh's efforts were, again, undermined by Tom's refusal to comply with the bail conditions. While Raleigh was trying to quit smoking, Tom made no such effort, and he created an environment that made it nearly impossible for Raleigh to succeed. By August, these tensions had reached a boiling point. Tom and Raleigh had planned a small, defiant gathering at Rainbow Farm despite the court injunction that had banned festivals on the property. The gathering was far from the grand events of the past, really just a few people sitting around smoking and talking. But it was enough to provoke Teeter, who used it as evidence to revoke their bail and push forward with the farm's forfeiture. Now, feeling the walls closing in, Tom began preparing for what he saw as the inevitable confrontation. He called on his friends and allies and asked them to retrieve their belongings from the farm. He even told Raleigh to leave town with the little money that they had left, but Raleigh refused to go without Robert. And so the two men, growing more and more isolated, seemed resigned to their fate. As the Labor Day weekend approached, Tom and Raleigh posted a message on the Rainbow Farm website announcing the cancellation of their planned festival. They had thanked their supporters and hinted at further developments, and it was a cryptic message that underscored the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Behind the scenes, they were dismantling the farm, selling or giving away anything of value in a desperate attempt to settle debts and protect what they could. Tom's despair deepened, and he became fixated on resisting the forfeiture at all costs. He spoke openly about refusing to comply with court orders, even if it meant violence. For Tom, the idea of surrendering the farm was unthinkable, and his anger at Teeter and the system that had turned Rainbow Farm into a target just consumed him, and had left little room for any type of hope or compromise. Raleigh, on the other hand, was gripped by his quieter but equally devastating loyalty to Tom, and his refusal to leave Rainbow Farm tied him to his death sentence. It was the most disappointing thing to read that Raleigh was not strong enough for Robert. I definitely have some thoughts on Raleigh that I am working out how to share because I don't want to come across harsh, but honestly, dude, what the fuck? I think I'll get more into that into the Final Thoughts episode that's coming out next, so please stay tuned for that. Many of Tom's friends tried to steer him in a different direction, even suggesting to leave the country to escape prosecution, but Tom was adamant. He would not abandon his farm. His refusal to back down, even in the face of these overwhelming odds, set the stage for this tragic conclusion. So in late August, Teeter made his move, and a letter arrived informing Tom and Raleigh that their bonds would be revoked if they did not appear in court on August 31st. The hearing would also address the farm's forfeiture, and it was a rapid timeline that left no room for any type of legal maneuvering. Tom knew that attending that hearing would mean prison and the loss of Rainbow Farm, and he was determined to not let that happen. So instead of preparing a defense, Tom and Raleigh spent their final days distributing the belongings and setting up the farm for their stance. On the night before the court date, Tom met with Doug, and the two of them stood on the property that they had built together, smoked a couple of cigarettes, and reflected on how it had all come down to this. Tom told Doug that he had no intention of appearing at court, and he said, "If I go to that hearing, I've lost." He urged Doug to tell the real story of Rainbow Farm after it was all over, hinting that he didn't expect to survive what was coming next. As the conversation ended, Tom shared chilling words that stuck with Tom. "I'm ready. I'm not scared of dying." It was a moment of finality and a signal that Tom had made his decision. Now, Tom and Raleigh, they were fully aware that they were crossing a point of no return. They had warned their neighbors, people like Butch McDonald, to leave the area because, in Tom's words, things were going to get ugly. Butch, who was a no-nonsense kind of guy, he trusted Tom's judgment enough to pack up and head over to his daughters without much of an argument. The story now takes place right where the book began. Tom is dressed in full camo and carrying a rifle, and he methodically goes about burning down Rainbow Farm, one building at a time. Basically, a dramatic goodbye to a dream that had been crushed under the weight of these legal battles and the impending forfeiture. Tom wasn't just burning the buildings. He was trying to make a statement. He had armed himself heavily, and he had weapons like a Ruger Mini 14 assault rifle and what he referred to as an elephant gun. There were rumors of a .50 caliber weapon, and they spread quickly, which created a panic among law enforcement, which prompted an influx of state police, tactical teams, and eventually the FBI to show up. While the reality of their arsenal may not have matched the hype, Tom's words and his actions sent a clear message that he was not going down without a fight. So law enforcement set up a perimeter and a command post at a nearby school, and they were waiting for the right moment to act. But they didn't just charge in. They tried to communicate through an intermediary who was a local man named Buggy, who knew Tom and Raleigh pretty well. Buggy reluctantly agreed to help, and he shuttled messages, supplies, and even McDonald's breakfasts back and forth. But each trip revealed just how tense things were inside the farmhouse. Tom was growing angrier by the hour, and his paranoia was stoked by the sight of helicopters, armored vehicles, and the increasing police presence. Now, while all of this was happening, the wider community started to mobilize. Friends and activists set up a protest camp nearby with signs like "Honk for Freedom" and "War on Peace." They hoped to draw attention to the injustice of forfeiture laws of Rainbow Farm's story. But in the media, Tom and Raleigh were painted as dangerous drug dealers rather than political activists, which enraged all of these supporters and added to this sense of alienation that Tom had felt. Tom's anger kept building, especially when his demand to speak with his son Robert went unanswered. Negotiators made efforts to keep the situation from escalating, but they weren't getting through. Robert was able to write a note to his dad, and it read, "From your son, Robert. Hey, Dad, please come out so no one gets hurt. I love you a lot. We can do all the fun things we did before, okay, Dad? I love you a lot. You remember all the good things we used to do, like playing paintball wars or bumper cars on the golf carts. I am safe and I'm okay. I am in good shape until you get out. Love, Robert." Things finally came to a head when Tom and an unexpected guest, a young man named Brandon Peoples, who had wandered into the farm barefoot, had left the farmhouse to retrieve resources from their neighbor's house. And so they had gone back to get a coffee pot. Now, as they walked back to the farm, they did end up crossing with the FBI snipers that were hiding in the woods. According to the FBI's report, Tom raised his rifle, and he prompted the agents to shoot. One shot struck him under the arm, but another hit him squarely in the head, killing him instantly. Brandon was frozen and covered in Tom's blood and brain matter, and he was left screaming in shock as the agents moved in. Tom's death marked a grim milestone in the standoff, but it was still far from over, and as the hours dragged on, Raleigh was left utterly alone, physically and emotionally. Though the house that he sat in was one that he had built with his own hands, it felt foreign. The structure offered no comfort, and the only companion that he had was Ty Stick, which was their loyal Rottweiler, who sat anxiously waiting for Tom to return. But Tom was gone, and without him, Raleigh struggled to find meaning in what remained. For the first time in years, Raleigh was just himself, and he had to decide who he was and what he would do next. Law enforcement reached out to Raleigh through a phone that was dropped near the house, and over the course of the night, he spoke with negotiators and tentatively agreed to surrender. The plan was to bring Raleigh's 12-year-old son to the farm, and Raleigh's condition for surrender was simple yet meaningful. He wanted to see his son one last time. Robert was anxious but hopeful, and he was ready to go. He wanted to save his dad, and he kept repeating that he just needed to get there in time. Negotiators assured Raleigh that Robert was on his way, and Raleigh began to prepare himself to walk out. But something shifted in those hours, and Raleigh fell silent, possibly asleep, and the tension in the air thickened. So around 3 a.m., police decided to fire some non-lethal rounds into the farmhouse to wake Raleigh. The loud cracks of the projectile that broke through the windows startled Raleigh, and he got on the phone and he asked why he was being shot at when he had agreed to surrender. The negotiators, they calmed him down, and he reiterated his desire to see his son, and the plan seemed back on track. Now around 6 a.m., smoke began to rise from the house, and reports indicated that Raleigh had set the straw hay bales that were in the house on fire. The house became a complete inferno, and the ammunition that was stored inside began popping and cracking as the flames spread. Robert and the foster parent whom he'd traveled to the farm with and were waiting nearby, but they were rushed away in a squad car as the situation spiraled out of control. Moments later, Raleigh emerged from the burning house, and he seemed disoriented, and he was carrying the Ruger rifle as he walked into the backyard. But his movements, they seemed frantic and confused. Some witnesses later debated whether Raleigh's actions were deliberate or instinctive. Was he trying to run back to save Ty's stick, who was tangled on the porch, or was he looking for a way out? Regardless, the snipers were under orders. Raleigh could not leave the area alive. Raleigh crouched near a spruce tree and gripped his rifle, and the snipers reported that he raised his gun toward officers and the approaching armored vehicle. And in that moment, Sergeant Daniel Lublin fired, and the bullet struck Raleigh through his chest and brought him down. Another shot followed as Raleigh hit the ground and ended his life. When the officers approached, Raleigh was already gone. The house continued to burn and ended up actually collapsing on itself entirely into the basement, and it took with it the remnants of Rainbow Farms' dreams. When the authorities finally relinquished control of Rainbow Farm, the sight was staggering. The house was gone, and it was reduced to nothing but the hollowed foundation. Every single piece of debris had been meticulously removed by the FBI. There wasn't even a charred stick that was left behind. Now, what did remain eerily untouched was the graffiti that Derek had painted on the basement walls. "Let freedom ring." The words stood in stark defiance against the clean orange dirt, which gave off this faint smell of sassafras. For John Livermore and the others that were close to the farm, the scene only fueled suspicions. To them, the lack of debris wasn't just a thorough cleanup. It was evidence of something being hidden. Livermore speculated that the authorities had burned the house down intentionally, blocking the exits, and even suspected that Raleigh had been captured, beaten, and then executed, rather than killed by the chaos of the standoff. His theories were at odds with the official reports, but he persisted, trying to find witnesses and forensic evidence to corroborate his fear. The search for answers extended beyond Livermore. Forensic pathologist Dr. Ronald Grazier, who was a seasoned expert with experience from high-profile cases like Waco, was brought in to investigate. Throughout the cold, rainy days that followed, Grazier and the others painstakingly measured the shot angles and examined what little evidence remained of Rainbow Farm. Now, the reports, they left much to be questioned. Raleigh's gun, which was a right-handed Mini 14, was puzzling for someone who was left-handed. Tom, who was ever attentive to Raleigh's needs, would never have bought him a gun that was so ill-suited. The angles of the shots, too, raised some concern. Raleigh's wounds didn't align cleanly with the narrative presented in the press briefings, and there were no fingerprints on the Ruger that he was supposedly holding. But despite these discrepancies, when prosecutor Scott Teeter refused his official report in the early 2002, the shootings were ruled as justifiable homicides. The investigations continued, particularly around Raleigh's death, which was left far murkier than Tom's. Witnesses, autopsies, and debriefing tapes provided conflicting accounts. On one tape, a sniper claimed to have targeted the mass of Raleigh's body, but in later testimony, he admitted aiming at Raleigh's back. This discrepancy, along with unexplained injuries noted in Raleigh's autopsy, which included missing testicles and an abrasion near his groin, led Livermore and others to question whether Raleigh had been subdued and then killed. So, by late 2002, Raleigh's family had filed wrongful death lawsuits. Though they pursued justice with renowned ballistic experts and forensic specialists, the evidence surrounding Raleigh's death remained muddled. What was clear to everyone involved, however, was that the events of Rainbow Farm had taken a devastating toll. For many, the tragedy of the farm was more than a loss of life. It was a damning indictment of a system that prioritized prohibition over humanity. Grazier captured this sentiment, saying, "Here you have an expensive farm burned down, a child deprived of his father and his home and removed to foster care, and 2 productive men dead. Is it worth that? To prohibit someone from smoking pot? I don't think so. Obviously, this is a flawed policy." The supporters of Rainbow Farm were left under heavy surveillance, and their every move was shadowed by the authorities. Tensions ran high, but so did grief, and the funeral for Tom and Raleigh were held amidst swirling emotions. At Tom's service, rain fell as the mourners gathered, and there was an eclectic mix between family, hippies, and friends from all around. As the rain lifted, a double rainbow appeared. It was a sign that some took as hopeful amidst all of the darkness. Now for Raleigh, the timing for his funeral added another cruel twist. It took place on September 11th of 2001, just hours after the Twin Towers fell. The grief for him was drowned in the collective shock of a nation, but those who knew him still came together to say goodbye. By the end of this chapter, what remained of Rainbow Farm's ideals had been extinguished, and the farm itself was sold and packaged off for development. The truth about what happened in those final days seemed destined to remain obscured. For the families and the friends left behind, the sense of injustice persisted, as did their belief that the events could have unfolded differently if the system had valued compassion over control. Robert was hit hardest by the tragedy. He wasn't allowed to attend his father's funeral or even know where he was buried. Child Protective Services decided that it would be best to keep him away from the mourners and anyone connected to Rainbow Farm. He was left to process his loss in isolation, and Robert would lash out in anger. He would punch walls and couches, and he would leave his hands bloodied. He wanted to see people that he trusted from the farm, like Travis and Derek, but it just wasn't allowed. And his grief was just a constant closed loop that was shared only with his foster family and his caseworker. Brandon Peoples, who had been walking just steps behind Tom when he was shot, struggled with the aftermath in his own way. And despite the rumors that he might have been a police plant, his friends believed otherwise. And in the days following the incident, Brandon gave brief, fragmented accounts saying things happened too quickly for him to know if Tom had raised his gun. Over time, Brandon distanced himself from everyone involved, and he ended up burning the blood-stained clothes that he wore that day, including the hemp shoes that Tom had given him. Shoes that he had sworn to keep with him until the day that he died. The events at Rainbow Farm were subject to intense scrutiny from many sides. Family members and supporters questioned the official narrative of what happened during the standoff, and the investigations were launched, which included forensic reconstruction and autopsies, but much of the evidence remained under the control of Scott Teeter. The reports ultimately cleared the officers of any wrongdoing, but not everyone was convinced. The Rainbow Farm community struggled to rebuild after the tragedy. Some moved away and others tried to stay and preserve what they could. But the farm was sold and some of the keepsakes did end up making their way to Robert. The party, the music, the shared dream of this utopia faded. But it didn't disappear entirely. Now, these tragic events at Rainbow Farm, they do serve as a reminder of the consequences of law enforcement overreach and the deep divide in our society over drug policy. Tom and Raleigh's deaths left a lasting impact, with a haunting question of whether it was worth it lingering in the air. For those who knew and loved them, the answer was clear. It wasn't. And I agree. I don't even know them, but I know that they did not deserve to lose their life. The fight at Rainbow Farm symbolized more than just this battle for cannabis legalization, though. It was a stand for freedom, autonomy, and the right to live by one's own beliefs. As we approach the final episode for Burning Rainbow Farm, we're going to be taking a step back for a more comprehensive overview of the entire book, the story, the writing, and all of the key takeaways. These episodes tend to be packed with recaps of the assigned reading, but this one will also highlight some crucial points that deserve more attention before we wrap things up. So make sure you hit subscribe and turn on that notification bell so that you won't miss out. Before we close today's episode, though, let's take one last dive into a topic that surfaced throughout the chapters that we explored: caliber. Now, I'm not exactly a gun girly, so I'll admit, the range of numbers and their significance had me a little overwhelmed. I'll also have up a few other words and terms that I had to define further to better help my understanding of the reading. Now, specifically, I want to focus on two calibers that came up in the story: the Mini 14's .223 and the .50 caliber. First, the Mini 14. This rifle is chambered in or designed to be used with a .223 Remington, a round that is both versatile and widely used. It's favored by law enforcement, hunters, and even civilian enthusiasts. Why? Because the .223 is perfect for close to medium range shooting. It has relatively low recoil and great accuracy, making it easy to handle for a range of activities from self-defense to target shooting. But what makes the Mini 14 so great for its purpose is that the .223 is fast and accurate, traveling at around 3,000 feet per second. It's effective for taking down smaller game and hitting targets with precision and providing some power in tactical situations. And with all that, it still is pretty manageable, so it's one of the go-to choices for people who need a practical, reliable firearm. Now, let's go in the complete opposite direction with the .50 caliber BMG, a round that is in a class all its own. BMG essentially refers to the specific cartridge used in high-powered machine guns and long-range precision rifles, because there is also a .50 caliber for smaller firearms. If the .223 is about speed and accuracy, the .50 is all about power. This round often is found in massive sniper rifles, which is what I'd assume was being referred to as Tom's elephant gun, and it can hit targets over a mile away with incredible force. We're talking about a bullet that can tear through vehicles, disable heavy equipment, and reach ranges that other rounds simply can't. The .50 BMG has an enormous impact on whatever it touches. Its sheer size and velocity make it capable of piercing armor and even taking down aircrafts. Now, while you won't see this in your average hunting trip or home defense scenario, it's essential in military operations where long-range precision is key. The recoil on a 50 BMG rifle is no joke. Shooting it requires a stable position and a strong grip, but its reach and stopping power make it a force to be reckoned with. So, not such a deep dive today, but still, just some information to really get the gravity of the situation that played out. Thank you so much for sticking with me through today's episode and diving into Burning Rainbow Farm by Dean Kuipers. It's always a bit wild to see how the story unfolds, and especially when you think you know where it's headed. I'm really grateful for all of the insight that I've been able to share along the way, and I can't wait to hear what you think about the rest of the book. So please don't forget to subscribe so that you can watch the final episode where we're going to get everything wrapped up next time. Until then, keep reading, keep growing, and I'll catch you in the next one.